Thanks for staying with us. Russian President Vladimir Putin had set today as the deadline for European countries to begin paying for Russian gas in rubles. However, he has since appeared to walk back on that demand after EU countries refused, raising the risk of a sudden stoppage in energy shipments. The Kremlin says this move would not affect shipments which were already paid for, with payments for deliveries after April 1 due in mid-April at the earliest. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, Western nations have placed sanctions on Russian companies and individuals. Unlike the US and Canada, the EU has not placed bans on oil or gas, as its member nations are heavily reliant on it. Now, here's a reminder of some of the international reaction to President Putin's threat to cut gas supplies to unfriendly countries if they don't start paying for gas in rubles. Now, Western companies and governments have rejected Russia's demands as a breach of existing contracts, which are set in euros or US dollars. Germany is Russia's largest customer in the EU. The country's economy minister, Robert Habeck, said it is important for us not to give a signal that we will be blackmailed by Putin. He added that we are convinced that contracts are contracts and the contracts are based on euro. And so he says we will continue to pay for energy imports in euro. France also insists that contracts, while the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says paying in rubles is not something they will be looking into. A little more detail is that the top 10 oil producers of oil, Russia is third biggest producer, with the US in first place, Saudi Arabia second, with about 5 million barrels of crude oil it exports each day. More than half of that goes to Europe. Russian imports account for 8% of total UK oil demand, and the US is less reliant, with about 3% of its imported oil coming from Russia in 2020. Well, Temitope Kolade Anderson is a senior oil and gas expert, senior manager, Power Oil and Gas. He joins us virtually. Thank you, Temitope, for joining us.
Thank you, Millicent. Good afternoon.
All right. Now, Russian leader, threatened to stop gas supplies from friendly countries, and then there seemed to be a walk back with what we're seeing, that where he mentioned that it would not affect shipments which were already paid for, with payments for deliveries after the 1st of April, but due mid-April at the earliest. Do you think this is some respite, and this is to those that are reliant on Russia's gas?
Definitely some respite. Apparently, carrying on with that initial threat to stop supply would have meant a great deal of, supply chain disruption for especially the European countries that depend largely on Russian gas. And if it says pay in rubles, it would mean, of course, there would be some scarcity of the rubles and the value would go up, especially because the value of the rubles have declined earlier. So, but what this means really is that you're creating some sort of enemies. People begin to take sides. If you want to continue to pay in rubles, for instance, you are seen as a friend of Russia, and otherwise you're seen as an enemy, and that would mean a lot. So if they had continued with that threat, it would mean that countries would have had to identify themselves as allies or enemies of Russia, and it then matters how many countries are willing to comply with that order to then be identified as either friends or enemies. So the fact that we're then seeing Russia slowing down on that is a big respite for the world at this point, because the speculation that comes with the pricing of oil is even more than the actual supply chain impact on the cost itself.
But does that decree help the Kremlin, resist an otherwise set of tough sanctions it's had?
Not necessarily, because the bigger the threat, the other it's more or less creating some additional tensions. As you've seen, the EU is basically pushing back to say that we're not going to do that. That's against sanctity of contract. And typically for gas supplies, what you see is long-term contracts, mid-term contracts, and the expectation is that you would abide by those contracts for at least the entire period which the contract specifies, right? So anything against that really is something pushing for some sort of tension from the other party too. The buyer will then continue to see, oh, can we really resolve this through diplomacy, or do we continue to push for further sanctions? I don't think it would have helped the Kremlin at this point, especially because it appears the rest of the world is also just aligning against the invasion of Russia.
And also with this, Germany says it will study the details of the demand, saying, of course, no political blackmail. But what's the alternative for perhaps EU nations? It has said that it's prepared some sort of emergency measures to manage the demand. But the question again is, how long that will last.
Okay, by far, you find that Germany actually has the greatest of the supplies from Russia amongst all of the European countries. And it's got a couple of gas network linked up to Russia in itself. And so it means a lot. However, there are some other points where Russia could get gas from Britain, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands via pipelines, right? And there are other alternatives, not to say the least. The United States, for instance, exports LNG, liquefied natural gas, and has tried to also provide some succor to Europe altogether. So there are some respite here and there, but the truth of the matter is that no single country can replace the sort of Russian gas supplies to Europe, especially again because most of the volumes are tied down to some long-term contracts from where they come from, and because you already have off-takers, you don't change that in the middle of the road just to support EU because of the crisis it's going into. So the alternatives here is maybe we start looking at some rationing, which the EU is already looking into to say, can we ration the supply to some quarters? And for instance, what we see with power supply in Nigeria, do we begin to see that with respect to gas supply in EU as well?
I was also going to ask about the Nord Stream 2 and how it really fits into this crisis.
Yeah, indeed. The Nord Stream 2 is a 1,200 kilometer pipeline, and it's on the sea, the Baltic Sea specifically. What it does is to carry the gas from Russia to Germany. But at the beginning of this crisis, or just before the beginning, Germany decided to halt that project to say that we're not going to grant any operating license for that. And what that would have done for Russia is that it would have given them some more power, because there'll be more reliance definitely on the gas from Russia. Already there is a Nord Stream that we could say is a Nord Stream 1 that provides some gas supplies to the rest of EU, and it's been doing that since 2011. But what it means also is that, for instance, in 2006, you realize that Russia had shut off some gas supplies that was going through Ukraine because of some financial crisis or quarrel between the two countries. And what this means is that if you also have Nord Stream 2, meaning that Russia could supply more gas to Europe and to the rest of the world, that would mean that there is some more weapons, some more power in the hand of Russia to fight the rest of the world, and especially EU, if they feel like they are not happy with what the rest of Europe is doing to them.
And the U.S. is weighing in a record amount of oil from U.S. strategic stockpiles. They're saying it's an unprecedented 1 million barrels a day to be released to the market. What will this do for the recipients?
Most definitely, what it will do is to help manage the spike in oil price that we're seeing at the moment, especially because Major increases that we've experienced resulted from speculation. So if US is also saying that going forward, we're going to try and release some supplies that we have in our reserves, you would see that the rest of the market would start reacting to that, and then prices begin to stabilize, or at least prices are managed to a point where it appears a bit more bearable for off-takers. But that will not provide all the respite that is required, because in actual sense, making that promise come true requires a lot. It requires getting the pipeline infrastructure in place to facilitate the supply. And of course, there is something tricky about gas also. It's not a commodity that you can easily transport from one location to the other. You need to think about the transit routes. You need to think about the transit fees and the contracts that need to be in place. So as much as US promises that, how to evacuate it is another thing that might take some time. So it's really neither here nor there. In terms of speculative pricing, we see, it could help to relax the nerves of people who are being speculative. But in the long run and in the midterm, it will take a while for us to have the infrastructure in place and to ensure that that promise is really coming true.
So if we come back to why, we started this conversation in the first place, and that is Russia's decree. We know the negotiations are still on between both countries. Some security analysts feel that it's just a smokescreen, as well as other people. But do you think that with this back and forth, Russia's upper hand with gas, and then parts of Europe to suffer from this, do you see an escalation, this economic battle affecting this conflict, this war between Russia and Ukraine, escalating things?
Definitely, there could be escalation, but we sincerely hope that escalations are not desirable, because diplomatic conversations are required at this point. Otherwise, the use of energy, the payment terms are bound to escalate the prices. And of course, it's not good for any part of the world, including our dear country. So the hope really is that we'll have things managed at this point, and would have both parties all of the parties involved in the crisis come to a round table and see that there is some management of this crisis, especially again, because when you go back in history, when, for instance, Russia stopped the supply of gas to Ukraine, it only lasted for a day at some point, right? So to a very large extent, too, we know that Russia is highly dependent on the revenues from fossil for its governance. So how long can it carry on without a continual patronage from the rest of the world? We only hope that things will pan out well. All parties will come to a round table and things will not escalate.
All right. Thank you for joining us. Temitope Kolade Anderson, Senior Manager, Power, Oil and Gas. Thanks for your expertise and thoughts on this issue.
Thanks, Millicent, for having me.
Well, staying with the deadline for European countries to begin paying for Russian gas in rubles, our Deutsche Welle correspondent, Chelsea Delany, joins us for more from Berlin. Hi, Chelsea. What's the latest there in the EU? Is Russian gas flowing still into the bloc?
We heard from Gazprom, the Russian natural gas supplier, that today they continue to send gas through their pipelines through Ukraine. They say they've received requests for about 108 million cubic of meters of natural gas from the EU, and they will send that. So Russian gas is still coming here, and that wasn't a given when we woke up this morning. This has been a very dramatic week for European natural gas markets, and what has already been a very dramatic year for European natural gas markets. And just for a little bit of background, last week, we did hear from Russian President Vladimir Putin that he wants European countries to pay for their natural gas in rubles. The EU was very much against that. They said that was a breach of contract. And all this week, we've seen a lot of back and forth between Putin and European leaders, basically a standoff of who would blink first, who would be the first to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to cut off your gas. We don't seem to be at that crisis moment yet. What Putin has basically offered European countries is a workaround. He said that basically European countries can open a bank account at the Gazprom bank in Russia, they can pay for their natural gas in euros or dollars, whatever currency that is stipulated in their contract. And what Gazprom Bank will then do is convert that money into rubles. So that means that European countries don't have to actually buy rubles themselves and send that. But the end effect is that Russia is still getting that money in rubles. So this does appear to be basically satisfying all parties. And we have seen a bit of relief on the natural gas market. I'd say that shows how, investors don't really see this as the crisis situation right now. Basically, the European natural gas prices, which have surged in recent days, have flattened out.
So disaster was averted today, we can say. But is there still a risk that Russia will cut off gas supplies in the future?
Yes, and I think Europe definitely can't take that for granted. We've seen a lot of politicians, many of the leaders here in Europe, saying this is something we need to prepare for in the months ahead. So we're seeing countries like France, Germany, Italy start to think about what they would do in the case that Russia does cut off that gas. The impact would be really catastrophic for many European countries. And all, Russia accounts for about 40% of the bloc's natural gas imports. They are really trying to bring that down quite quickly. They do have a goal of reducing Russian natural gas imports by about 2/3 by the end of this year. But at this moment, many countries are still very much reliant on Russian natural gas. And the prospect of that being cut off overnight would certainly cause huge problems for the European economy. Right now, we do see countries saying that they will continue to pay for this gas in their currencies in euros, but I think we'll see maybe at the end of this month really the effects of this, because that's when these payments are actually due. So the gas that countries are importing today, in the next couple of weeks, they'll actually have to make those payments at the end of the month or in the beginning of May. So that's when we'll really see whether this loophole is solving the issue.
And Chelsea, Germany already this week triggered its emergency gas plan due to the rising risk of supplies being disrupted. What happens next?
So this plan, it's the first stage of the emergency plan. So this is really the warning level. There are two higher levels. And basically what it means is that the German regulators, the German economics ministry, is going to start thinking about rationing. And this is particularly for industrial rationing. They're going to look at, different industries and figure out who could do with less natural gas, who would be shut down if Russia does pull that lever and cut off natural gas supplies. And because of Germany's industrial sector, it is really the industrial heartland of Europe. This would hit particularly hard. It's not just, households that are dependent on natural gas for things like heating or electricity. Natural gas is also used for industrial heating and cooling for the chemicals industry. So this would have really widespread impacts. What we haven't heard the government really discuss at all yet is cutting or rationing power or natural gas to households. So that's a bit of a relief. But we heard yesterday from the German Council of Economic Experts that if we did see a situation where Russia cuts off natural gas, that we could see inflation surge to over 10%, so double digits. So this is something that would raise the risk of both the recession and much higher inflation than we're already seeing here in Germany.
Deutsche Welle correspondent Chelsea Delaney, many thanks for joining us. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency says that Russian forces' departure from the decommissioned Chernobyl power plant is a step in the right direction, and the UN nuclear watchdog plans to be there very, very soon. The IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi says he will head a support mission to Chernobyl, the site of 1986 nuclear disaster, and that further nuclear safety missions to Ukraine will follow. He says the general radiation situation around the plants is quite normal, adding there may have been again a rise in radiation due to dust kicked up by military vehicles as Russian forces left Chernobyl.
The general radiation situation around the plant is quite normal. There was a relatively higher level of localized radiation because of the movement of heavy vehicles. at the time of the occupation of the plant, and apparently this might have been the case again in the way out. We heard about the possibility of some personnel being contaminated, but we don't have any confirmation about that. What we know is what we want to see as far as the nuclear power facilities in Ukraine is concerned. And this is undoubtedly a step in the right direction. We had been saying that the plant needed to be operated by its own natural operators, which was the case, that it had to have physical integrity protected, that the people there had to work under normal circumstances. As I said, I would not put my staff in harm's way, but we need to recognize that there is an armed conflict and there is shelling, and so we need to have secure routes. We need to have protection. We need to have zones that are deconflicted to move through.
And about Russia's praises for India, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a meeting with his Indian counterparts in New Delhi. Lavrov's mission to shore up support from a country Moscow has long regarded as a friend comes a day after senior US and British officials held talks in New Delhi to persuade the Indian government to avoid undermining sanctions imposed after Russia invaded Ukraine late February. Well, following the meeting, Mr. Lavrov praised India for not judging the conflict in Ukraine in a one-sided way. India has not joined the widespread condemnation of Russia's invasion and is a major buyer of Russian arms.
Indeed, as you mentioned, this day our Western colleagues would like to reduce any meaningful international issue to the crisis in Ukraine. You know our position. We do not hide anything, and we appreciate that India is taking this situation in the entirety of facts, not just in a one-sided way. Friendship is the key word to describe the history of our relations, and our relations were very sustainable during many difficult times in the past. And I have no slightest doubt that mutual respect and the search for balance of interest would prevail in our relations for the future as well. We have been developing especially privileged strategic partnership with New Delhi, and this is one of the key priorities of the Russian foreign policy. It's equality and mutual trust, which underlies our acts on the international arena, and in the context of multipolar world, which is being objectively shaped, as you alluded to yesterday, addressing a conference in New Delhi. We certainly are interested in having the world order balanced.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warns that China's reputation is at stake if it helps Russia evade international sanctions. It follows an online summit with China's President Xi Jinping. China has refused to condemn Russia for its invasion, while the EU has imposed sanctions on Moscow. President Xi said China and Europe should provide stability in a volatile world following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but did not appear to offer any proposals to end the war.
The EU and China, we agreed that this war is threatening global security and the world's economy. This global instability is not in China's interest and not in the EU's interest. We share a responsibility as global actors to work for peace and stability. We called on China to help end the war in Ukraine. China cannot turn a blind eye to Russia's violation of international law, and these principles are enshrined in the UN Charter and principles sacred to China. Any attempts to circumvent sanctions or provide aid to Russia would prolong the war. This would lead to more loss of life and greater economic impact. This is not in anyone's long-term interest.
So we also made very clear that China should, if not support, at least not interfere with our sanctions. We discussed that and also the fact that no European citizen would understand any support to Russia's ability to wage war. Moreover, it would lead to a major reputational damage for China here in Europe.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has met with a group of Ukrainian MPs in Ottawa. The parliamentarians called for more action from Canada to deter further Russian military action against Ukraine. The Canadian Prime Minister joined the allies in saying he does not wish to see Russian President Vladimir Putin at this year's G20 meeting.
Back there, but what you're doing, what you did in Washington, as leaders, as parliamentarians, but also as individuals who have family members back home. I know this can't be an easy trip for you. I know you want to be back there, but what you're doing, what you did in Washington, what you're doing here today really, really matters. I look forward to hearing directly from you on how things are going, but also how deliberations are unfolding in Parliament and what more Canada can do to help. Obviously, that's a big topic of conversation that I have regularly with President Zelensky, with Christia has with the Prime Minister and other officials, but hearing directly from you will be very, very important.
We would like to highlight that it's not a war between Ukraine and Russia, it's a war between evil and democratic world. So in this war, we have to win. We believe that we will win, and we are winning. But of course, we need your support. We need really great partners in this struggle. You know, we had a lot of very, very important meetings, and on this meeting we heard that Ukraine now is a symbol of struggle. We don't want to be a symbol of struggle, we want to be a symbol of victory for democratic world, for democratic values. And now Canada has really historical chance to be our friend and symbol of this victory too.
With almost 300,000 refugees from Ukraine registered in Germany, according to the Interior Ministry, some have had to turn to food banks for help. A charity official in charge of food distribution at a Berlin church turned food bank says they are trying to find ways to cope with the demand. Earlier this week, Germany called for a more even distribution of Ukrainian refugees in the European Union after some 3.8 million people, now over 4 million, fled Russian President Vladimir Putin's war in their country and crossed into the 27-nation bloc. Since Russia invaded its neighbor on February 24, the fighting has displaced more than 10 million people, forced nearly 4 to flee Ukraine in Europe's biggest refugee crisis since the end of World War II. This is according to the United Nations Refugee Agency.
In Berlin, our family, it's okay because...
Well, let's look at right now some of the key events so far this day, April 1st, Friday, day 37 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, Ukrainian President Zelensky is warning that Russia is consolidating and preparing powerful strikes, he calls it, in the country's south, including the city of Mariupol. NATO also says it is not seeing a pullback of Russian forces in Ukraine, expects additional offensive actions, this according to the alliance head, Jens Stoltenberg. And Russia is refocusing its military efforts on the eastern Donbas region. This could herald a longer, more prolonged conflict as Ukrainian forces put up fierce resistance there. This is according to a senior U.S. defense official. Also, Russian forces have pulled out of the defunct Chernobyl nuclear power site and moved towards Belarus, but they took an unspecified number of captive Ukrainian servicemen. This is reports coming in from Kyiv. Now, troops seized control of the Chernobyl site where radioactive waste is still stored on February 24, the first day of the invasion. And U.S. President Joe Biden says his Russian counterpart may be isolated and he said that he could have placed some of his advisors under house arrest. President Biden also says he is skeptical about Moscow's claim to be scaling back its onslaught in parts of the country. And a look at diplomacy in this war, the European Union is set to hold a virtual summit against a backdrop of increasing alarm over Beijing's growing proximity to Moscow. Also, European Parliament President says that she's on her way to Ukraine, making her the first EU leader to visit the war-torn country. And Turkey says the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine could meet within about a week or two to step up negotiations on ending the conflict. Turkey appears very optimistic, and Russia says it would expand the list of EU figures banned from entering the country following Western sanctions. Well, that's a wrap on today's program. Thank you for watching. I'm Melissa Ntwaka. Have a good evening.